Yes, I know. A title like this screams clickbait. However, everything is coming directly from Nintendo, not an insider, leaker, or your neighbor's cat. This is a real collection of interviews and announcements from the president of Nintendo, Miyamoto, job listings going into great detail looking for developers to work on these next-gen consoles, even statements from Nvidia, who produces the Nintendo Switch, and many others. Some of these mention a successor to the Nintendo Switch, some mention a 3DS successor or next-gen dual-screen mobile gaming device, and some are left kind of vague. This is not every single statement or interview about the next-gen consoles, as that would make this video well over an hour long, and no one wants to hear my voice for that long. Before we begin, timestamps should be on the screen. I do want to say thank you to all of our amazing Patreon supporters. Your names can be seen on screen here and at the end of every video, along with your shoutout. Starting with the Nintendo 3DS successor. Some of these talk about an actual 3DS successor, and others just mention a new handheld gaming console. In an interview from Kyoto Shinbun, Nintendo president, at the time, Kimishima, is quoted as saying he is considering a 3DS successor because he sees a need and market for it. In another interview, Furukawa states the 3DS style of gaming is still really popular with gamers, and with its dual screens, it offers a unique gameplay style that is impossible on Switch. This fuels their interest in pursuing development of hardware that would continue to offer and improve upon the 3DS style of gameplay. A while before this, a known insider posted on Twitter that Nintendo was working on a 3DS successor. In a follow-up tweet, he states apparently Furukawa has said to Japanese press that Nintendo are considering a successor to the 3DS. Considering is an odd choice of words, as I already know it exists. Sometime before this, the Nintendo president also hinted at a successor. TrustedReviews.com writes, Nintendo president hints at possible follow-up to the 3DS. In reply to this, a convenient, now deleted tweet from the CEO, one of Nintendo's consultancies, actually added to the president's statement, putting more weight behind this new console. Sadly, we just have replies to what he said, but everything implies that he may have said something that he probably shouldn't have, and that is why the tweet is deleted. In a slightly skewed interview with Nakai and Furukawa, PCMag.com writes, Furukawa explains his main concern is about the Nintendo experience. Many would view that as the combination of Nintendo hardware and software, but when asked about innovation, Furukawa suggests flexibility and ingenuity combined with changes in technology mean, in the long term, perhaps our focus as a business could shift away from home consoles. He goes on to state that in order to reduce instability, he also wants Nintendo to increase the number of smartphone games it makes. In another interview, which we actually covered long ago on our podcast, the Hylian Gamescast, which you can watch here, Nintendo stated something similar to one of the earlier interviews, with Nintendo experimenting and developing future hardware in the 3DS dual-screen style. Miyamoto even stating he has lots of great ideas, which aren't possible on the Nintendo Switch. Moving on to the Nintendo Switch successor. One report we have covered a few times directly involves Nvidia, stating they are ending production of the Nintendo Switch Tegra chip. So even if Nintendo had absolutely zero interest in creating a next-gen console, Switch Pro, Switch 2, or whatever you want to call it, and they were determined to only focus on the Nintendo Switch, they would have no choice but to move on and begin production of a new console. This is because Nintendo Switches simply can't be produced without the specific chip, but that's just common sense. No console, computer, or device is going to work without one of its most expensive parts. Not to mention, this isn't just Nintendo or Nvidia. Every company is in the middle of a massive CPU shortage. This CPU shortage was actually thought to be the reason behind the Switch OLED. Insiders, leakers, and credible journalists who all predicted the Switch Lite, despite the many times Nintendo denied it was in development, were also stating a Switch Pro would be coming after. Instead, we received the Switch OLED. Is it just a coincidence the leaks had almost every spec and detail about the Switch OLED correct? except for the performance? Or could it be Nintendo originally planned to release the Switch Pro as it was rumored, but due to the CPU and GPU shortage, they simply weren't able to, and had to release it with the cheaper and less powerful chip found within the original Switch? Now, moving on, Nintendo themselves confirms an upcoming next-gen console. Verge writes, on the investors slide, which you can see for yourself on page 41 here, Nintendo has a timeline of some of its hardware efforts and specifically includes its next gaming system, slated to release at an undefined 20XX date, which is essentially just a placeholder. On our Hylian Gamescast, one of our great friends, Spawnwave Media, joined Daniel and I to discuss an, at the time, recent job listing for a new lead graphics architect for a next-gen console which was beginning development. Sadly, the original job listing, like all job listings when the position is filled, was removed. However, you can hear Spawnwave, Daniel, and I read through the entire listing, an article covering it, and give our thoughts on all of it. Nintendo's Shinya Takahashi hints that a new game system is on the horizon. Nintendo constantly works on hardware. This statement is as vague can be. Can't really tell if it is on the 3DS successor, Switch successor, or something else we haven't even thought of yet. Maybe the Virtual Boy Advanced. Nintendo Enthusiast has a great article sourcing interviews and quotes of multiple people from Nintendo and gathering the evidence to support a Switch successor. In it, Nintendo President Tatsumi Kimishima states, Nintendo has been thinking about its next system. They continue the original Switch began development in 2012, not even a year after the Wii U launched. Now, sadly, the main article they source is behind a paywall, so unless you subscribe to that news outlet, you can't read much else on the topic. But it brings a valid point. Just like with every Zelda game, every Mario game, everything Nintendo does. As soon as they were done with the Wii, a portion of that console's development team broke off and began development on the Wii U. And less than a year after the Wii U released, the same thing happened, and Nintendo started research and development on what would become the Nintendo Switch. Just as soon as Twilight Princess was finished, they began work on Skyward Sword, and as soon as Skyward Sword was finished, they began work on Breath of the Wild. When these companies finish a product, they don't take a month or two off. They literally begin development on the next thing. And we have dozens of quotes and interviews here from many of the high-up people who work at Nintendo, all of whom have confirmed they have been hard at work on not just a next-gen Nintendo Switch successor, but even a return to the dual-screen portable handheld gaming consoles. For as many times as we have Nintendo denying they were working on Skyward Sword HD, denying the Nintendo Switch Lite, denying Majora's Mask 3D was in development, stating the Nintendo 3DS was absolutely perfect, so they would have no reason to release a second version of it. And then a month later, announcing the 3DS XL, followed by the new 3DS, new 3DS XL, 2DS, and new 2DS XL. So when they literally promised us there was only going to be one model of the 3DS, they literally released 5 or 6 more. And think back to how Nintendo stated it would be almost impossible to bring Skyward Sword to the Switch in HD with traditional controls, while you've probably been playing that exact game. So sadly, you can't really go on what Nintendo says or doesn't say, but I still love them. I'm still a huge fan. I'm still looking forward to the next-gen 3DS successor, the Nintendo Switch 2, Switch Pro, whatever they end up calling it. You can guarantee that I'll be picking it up to play Breath of the Wild 2. For those of you who have listened this long, and speaking of Breath of the Wild, happy Halloween. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching. We have a few new Patreon supporters that I would like to give a thank you to. If you would like your own shout out, then head over to patreon.com/GameOverJessie, where you can receive a ton of different rewards while helping us out. Those of you who are just donating a single $1, that really does help more than you would think. Thank you Monica Spath, NORNARB, Shadow to Us, SOBERX, ANDREMOI, NATSU, Rusty Caulfield, Zoe M, Candy, David Guthman, Ashton Wren, BKRS7, Blargnar, Chad Costin, Gus Calvo, Henry, Jesse Birch, Jesse Wood, Jon Snow, Larulian Sheep, Lovable Christie, Mr. Monocled Metroid, Super NX64, and ZAIN.